Welcome everyone to the Mindset Podcast, where each episode we explore how embracing adversity can lead to positive change. A little over 6 years ago I got sober from alcohol and drug addiction, and what I learnt during that period of time was how the biggest or smallest challenges in my life paved the way for the most positive and enriching period of growth and learning I've ever experienced. FRP is a people-focused firm, both with our excellent teams internally and clients we work with day to day. Like many other professional services firms, we give particular attention to delivering the best advice for people under what can often be extremely stressful situations. So it follows, spending time understanding how we can learn and grow from any periods of adversity we face will also see us evolve and grow as individuals and better serve our clients. This podcast aims to provide inspiration for others trying to progress in their careers, help professionals feel less isolated on their journey, and debunk the myth that we all have to be all right all of the time. Most importantly, we want to walk the walk of change and integrity with the experience of others who have walked the path before us. Challenges can be used for good. I absolutely believe this fact. I hope you enjoy. As a starting point, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No, not at all. Thanks for agreeing to come on to what we're calling the Mindset Podcast. So it'd be really interesting or useful, I think, if you can give us some background about who you are and what you currently do as a kind of introduction and a hello.
Okay, yep, sure. So my name's Abigail, and I currently work as a self-employed consultant, helping organisations develop their strategic approach to mental health and wellbeing at work, which sounds complicated, but it's not really. It's just working with businesses to see what can help people thrive, and when people feel unwell, what their business can do to support them.
Yeah.
So my background is I worked as a psychotherapist originally, so I trained in psychotherapy and I worked with people who were unwell, who would come to me for therapeutic support, and then I moved into psychology, more sort of business psychology, because what I saw was a lot of the people who came to me who were unwell, actually it was often to do with the environments they were in. So I became more focused on how can we adapt and change the environment so the person doesn't become unwell as a result of it.
Yes, yeah, that's interesting. And what the overarching theme of this series of podcasts is, embracing adversity for positive change, and because the reality, of course, is as humans we all just have our own individual challenges and adversity, and definitely in the corporate world sometimes, I know from my experience, it felt inappropriate to somehow reveal that or talk about that, which just doesn't make any sense to me now. I'm on the other side of a lot of it. I still have my challenges for sure. So I wanted to get your insight as to why, before we kind of, understand a bit more about your journey, as to why, well, two things really. Why you think that we as humans kind of naturally shy away from challenges, or perhaps when we're in a challenge we feel that it's really all negative, even though from my experience it isn't. It's a great opportunity for growth. And also what it is about coming through adversity that kind of helps us change, whether that's cognitively or from a mental health perspective, or just any kind of view you have on it, really.
And I think the concept of embracing adversity is a slight paradox, I guess, because when you're in adversity, you can't embrace it, because actually you are so focused in an adaptive way to respond to the adversity that you're not necessarily able to understand that actually this is something that's actually going to be beneficial, potentially. Yeah. So it's how you manage the challenge and how you come through the challenge on the other side that's actually the key part to it. So that obviously that very well-known quote, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, but when we're in it, it's very hard to understand the strength we might gain from it. And what people tend not to do so much is, once they've gone through adversity, is actually reflect on what's happened to them, how did they respond to it, what are the changes they're now going to make. We talk a lot about resilience, and typically resilience gets called bounce back, but it's not about bouncing back. It's actually moving on from what you've challenged, because if you've experienced something absolutely tragic in your life, you can't bounce back to where you were before. What you can do is understand how you coped, how you managed, what the positive lessons you got, who was around you, who supported you, what you needed, what some of the negative coping strategies you might have used when you were in that space, and then use that to inform you next time you hit an adversity. So it's about learning to take forward to the next time. Yeah,
okay. So actually a key, I guess, in terms of understanding how to convert the kind of negative experience into a positive is the willingness to self-reflect, by the sounds of it.
I think self-reflect, but I think you have to be careful, because too much self-reflection can actually lead to negative emotions as well. We have to be very careful. What makes us feel good and what gives us purpose is actually giving to others and being with others. So spending too much time in that self-reflection can be detrimental as well. So it's that sweet spot. But also it's about, when we go through a challenging time, it's how we, rather than thinking, well, once I've got through this, I'm going to get this, it's actually what was the progress that I made on that journey? What was the thing that I learned? We can't actually enjoy anything without a negative, without struggling to get there. Enjoyment only happens, or satisfaction only happens from dissatisfaction. We need to, it's like as a baby, you need to not be given milk to actually enjoy the satisfaction of being given the milk. I mean, because everything in my life and my experiences and my training goes back to our early experiences. So we have to have the struggle to enjoy the outcome,
which makes sense. And then of course, if you do have a period of self-reflection and you can extract the value from it, then you had the wisdom for next time to go, although this is particularly unpleasant, I've got a feeling there's probably lots of wisdom to be gleaned here as well. That's certainly been my experience anyway.
Yes,
it gives
exactly.
some comfort to what is otherwise, and I'm not saying any of us want to live in adversity or necessarily uncomfortable challenge, but equally that is where a lot of the learning takes place, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So in that challenge, and it's also about helping others with what you've learned. So it's not just about actually what can I do next time. So I know people who go through really difficult times and they can't support others, but once they've been through that difficult time, what have they learned, and then what can they pass on to other people? It may be a different experience, but actually it's something that we can also share with others, which again brings us back to that importance of connection, and giving to others is one of the key contributors to feeling well and having high levels of well-being.
And how do you think that translates into the corporate world? Because what you've just described there is, if it's in our personal life, that's our individual problem. But of course, there isn't really an awful lot of difference, I don't think. And obviously, I'm intrigued to know what your view is as to the approach in the corporate world in terms of how do we get better at what we're doing, whether that's for the people within the organisation or the client. And we've done something where the job hasn't gone particularly well, or someone hasn't done what they need to do. How do we actually pause and reflect in a way that's beneficial for us, both as our approach as whether we're a leader or our approach as delivering the products for the client versus, well, okay, the project's done now, so let's just move on. Do you think it's a completely different dynamic in the corporate world? Do you think how does that play out, do you think?
I think we go back to where we started, which was something you were talking about, vulnerability and admitting vulnerability. And I think the corporate world doesn't lend itself to that type of approach, because it sees vulnerability as weakness rather than something actually, this went wrong, how do we address it, what can we do next time? It's not something you necessarily need to publicly share, but you may have heard the concept of psychological safety. Mm-hmm. Psychological safety is being able to say, do you know what, I messed up, I didn't do that, didn't work quite well, it could have worked a bit better if we did it like this, let's think about what we did, take 5 minutes, that's all it takes. But what happens often is we're fearful of admitting things like that, we're fearful of making mistakes, we think we're going to get, in inverted commas, told off, or we're going to lose our jobs, so we don't admit it. And we're fallible. We're going to make mistakes. These things are going to happen. But there are plenty of cultures that I see, not just in the corporate world, where actually people are scared of making mistakes or scared of admitting to error. And that's a bit about being vulnerable, being able to do that, but in a safe, contained space where it's not going to be detrimental. It's seen as a growth. You talk about mindset, and growth mindset is, a part of the phrase. Actually, that's how you grow. By learning what didn't go wrong, holding your hand up, could have done this differently, what do I need in order to learn more, and then making a difference. But it doesn't get practiced enough.
Yeah, and I can kind of understand why it doesn't get practiced enough, and because it's super counterintuitive, I think, especially if you're from a certain era or you're working in a particular sector within the corporate world, to go, well, the best thing we can do here, because if we imagine ourselves in a meeting or in a corporate situation, a lot of what you're trying to portray is, I know what I'm doing, you can have confidence in me, and I've got ability. And my old self would say, well, I'm certainly not going to show you vulnerability in that, because how am I going to think? And I would now, just for me and my journey, call that a naive approach, because I do think someone who's more mature or wise to life wouldn't see that per se. But let's say that is the backdrop that a lot of people could relate to. how then does vulnerability become an important part of that process? I.e., we know what we're doing, we can deliver results, we're good, we have ability. How would you say that, okay, we'll appreciate that room, if that's a room of people saying that, but you need to have vulnerability, and this is why. Why do you think that's such a key?
Well, I don't know necessarily whether vulnerability is actually the right word here. I think it's about something about honesty and authenticity, really. And I think it's also about, I agree, as a practitioner, I know from my personal circumstances how, when I've been challenged and struggled, how I've had to hold that together when I've gone out and been speaking, on platforms like this and discussing things and going to businesses and standing up in front of a group of, 20 business leaders and being able to hold my own and be very confident. And when you're struggling personally, you have to sort of put that mask on. So I think there's always a need for some sort of, for a, not mask, carapace, something where you keep yourself solid, where you feel like your feet are planted on the ground. I think we all need to have that when we're in those situations, but that doesn't mean we can't be authentic with challenges we've had. It's the right time and the right place. It may not be something you're going to talk about with your customers, but it may be something you're going to talk about quietly. So when you talk about sort of achievement and success, well, success, nobody starts A, B, C, D, do you? You get to B, and then you may go back a little bit to A, and then you go forward. Nobody's, and your clients that you're dealing with will also have had their challenges. So if you approach that with empathy and compassion and authenticity, whilst holding your credibility as somebody who's an authority on a subject, that's very safe for the person to be with you in that space then, because they recognise you know what you're talking about, but actually you also recognise what struggle is and what challenge is.
Yes, yeah. And as a leader within an organisation, that's equally important, to show that you're obviously, actually to show the trajectory, which, as you say, is not a straight line.
No.
I'm equally as fallible, but perhaps the difference is I'm trying to learn from my mistakes and move forward. But also I'm not, it's multi-layered, isn't it? Because it also opens up connection more, it opens up approachability, it opens up a more accepting culture. That's just my view anyway. But
it legitimises conversations further downstream where people wouldn't necessarily have those conversations, that actually it's okay to admit, whatever you want to call it, vulnerability, fallibility, weakness, whatever you want to say. But just recognising that, people are fallible, and you don't know what anybody's bringing into the workplace that day. So that chief exec might come in looking absolutely like a boss, absolutely tough. But actually, trust me, what has happened to them before they left the house will not be the same as the mask that they have in. But it's how I think it takes quite a lot of ego strength as a leader to be able to actually to admit that and to find that place. And I think it can happen possibly when people are a bit more experienced, and actually you've got greater perspective, haven't you? You can see, actually, do you know what, when I messed up and I admitted it 10 years ago, nothing happened. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't actually that bad a thing. But I think, and this is part of a bigger sociological question, we live in a sort of a society that does value, equals strength with success, and equals sort of like holding yourself together as power. And I think I think it is important. Like I said, I think there is a balance to be had. I don't think it's all about going in and talking about your feelings every day, all day with people, because actually, no, we need to actually, as I said, take away that total self-absorption to a certain extent and park that and actually think about what's the bigger picture, what am I here to do, who are my clients, who do I need to serve, who are my colleagues, what's actually going on around me, rather than being completely, caught up in our own heads. Yeah,
and there's science and research behind all of it in terms of increasing productivity, I think, and creating a more efficient environment. If I'm able to sit and go, well, actually, I'm feeling particularly stressed or overwhelmed about this deadline, and I feel comfortable sitting down and speaking to you and going, I feel this way and I don't feel like you're going to judge me, or I feel like I can trust you, that's going to help alleviate some of that stress in the moment. And of course, in that moment, I may be going into a spiral of unproductivity.
Totally.
Yeah, because of that. So actually, by simply having an overarching concept of, we're human, and as you say, vulnerability doesn't need to be the word. And interestingly, you used ego strength as opposed to what I would say, which is humility, which I quite like, because I think they're either sides of the spectrum, but they achieve the same thing in many ways. To be and as you say, in balance, open. That doesn't mean I'm coming into the office every day going, I'm falling to bits, because that doesn't work either. But that then starts to permeate down into a situation, culture, environment whereby people can go, okay, I can't pretend I am super stressed about this. And how does that benefit people and organisations, do you think?
Well, I don't think stress is one of my favourite subjects, okay, because I don't think we really understand significantly enough the detrimental impacts of stress on the body and the brain and the mind and our product, and then the outputs that comes from that. So I think when you said I'm super stressed, I suppose for me it's thinking, well, actually, ideally, if I was a boss, I wouldn't want you to get to super stress, because when you're at super stress, it's like when you're thirsty and you have a glass of water, you're thirsty. Actually, you needed to have the glass of water 3 hours ago. So when you say you're super stressed, you've already gone into a place of lack of productivity. Your brain's not going to be functioning as well as it can. Potentially, if that goes on for a long time, it will have negative effects on your physical health as well. So I think that organisations that I've worked with that I think are who really recognise the importance of understanding pressure, because it's pressure that leads to stress. Pressure's natural, we need pressure. Pressure's important for us to perform and to do things, but understand that point when people get to, when those pressures build up and they become stressed as a result. That to me is a really, really important learning that organisations can benefit from.
Yeah. And when would you say in your life, in your, I guess, your personal life, when would you say was the first time you experienced like an understanding of that sense of overwhelm or stress? You started, so you went to university and you trained to be a therapist, is that right?
I did. I didn't go to university the first time around. I went and did a master's when I was in my mid-20s and did psychotherapy then. Yeah, trained then.
So you started working in your mid-20s as a therapist, or you were working before?
No, I was working before. So originally I did business studies, which was completely the wrong path for me because I failed my maths O-level and had to retake it. So I don't know. But there was a family, it was a family business. And then I worked in property for about 8 years in London in a property company. And I'd lived in New York as well in my early 20s when I worked there. And actually that's probably a time when I experienced workplace stress. And I didn't realise it at the time. But I had a boss who was a bully, and I never realised at the time. And I had an overextended sense of responsibility, thinking that everything was my fault. And because he was a bully, that's what happens, isn't it? You believe that actually it's something you're doing wrong.
Yeah.
And that was the first time I probably experienced stress from a workplace perspective, I would say. Yeah. And then I went into property, and then whilst I was doing property, I'd always known that I want to be a psychiatrist. Originally, that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a psychiatrist, but I wasn't any better at science, and I wasn't maths, so that I had to forget that one. And then I did a counselling course in the evening. Thought, actually, I quite like this. And then I did some crisis work. I worked in a voluntary crisis centre where people would come in off the street. It was in Marylebone, and they would just come and talk to you. Had no idea who they were, what they were bringing, and you'd only see them for an hour, and then they'd go again. And they'd come with the most unbelievable stories. I mean, and the fact they sort of trusted me was such a gift.
What do you think was the biggest learning you took from that period, doing that specific service for people?
I think learning that everybody's got a story, and everybody needs to, wants to actually share their story. And if you give somebody the space for an hour, actually it can help people just to feel heard and listened to. The benefit, well, actually, I sort of think time to listen is actually probably where we really need to be a bit more. And that's, I think, just listening. And I felt, I was 22 or 23, I was young. And I remember sort of feeling slightly, we call it imposter syndrome now. But I remember that, I didn't even know that as a term, thinking, oh my goodness me. But actually people, and funny enough, they didn't see you. They didn't see me as a 22-year-old, as a woman, or as, whatever. They just saw you as somebody who was there and gave them space. Yeah. And that's what mattered.
Yeah. Which is a great perspective giver at a young age, I think.
Absolutely,
that experience sounds like a pretty phenomenal experience to. So you then went back, retrained, and then you started working mid-20s, did you say, as a therapist?
Yeah, so I worked, because you have to do clinical practice as your training. Yeah. So I decided I wanted to work in higher education because I wanted to work with young people. That was the area that I really felt I really was interested in working in. And I like the idea of working in education, in academic environment. So I did training in a university, and then I stayed at the same university. So I started as a trainee, and then I got a post as a counsellor, and then I got head of service. So it happened in a very, very short space of time. Probably, I don't know, about 4 years or 5 years. I went from a trainee to being head of service.
And how long was your career as a therapist before you moved into?
I probably worked in about 15 years.
And over those, do you remember at the time when you went into that? So you're already pivoting because you kind of family business, then property, then New York, then you're doing that, then you're going to this. Do you remember having fears going into that new phase of your life around retraining to be a therapist, starting to be a therapist, and moving into that? And I'm assuming at the same time, starting a family and everything that came with it. Do you recall, or were you at an age where you were just simply ploughing on through?
No, I mean, you're right. All of those things happened at the same time. I moved away. I met my husband, and I moved to another part of the country. I remember the day I gave my dissertation in for my master's, it was 2 days before I had my first daughter.
Right.
So it was very much a trajectory that I was on. But I remember it was my dream job. Do you know what I mean? I'd absolutely got my dream job, and I was really happy. I was married, I had a family, I had a beautiful little girl. I felt, it was really, really good. I was really, really happy, and I was ploughing through. But I've also, and again, I think a lesson I've learned as I've got older is I did a lot of things very quickly. I had quite quick progressions in lots of things, and rather than taking a step back and going, wow, gosh, that was really good, I did, achieved that, and whether achieved's not the right word, I was on to the next thing. So I remember when I was running the counselling service, I got the service accredited, which was a really big deal. It was the second university in the country to get the service accredited. I was pregnant with my second child, I think then. And then I won a tender for the staff counselling service, which was again a big deal. But I didn't sort of go, but I then thought, well, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? Yeah. Not really actively, but then I know that, but then I've learned again alongside it is there are people who are like that, and there are people who aren't like that, and I'm like that. I'm somebody who, I think there was a meme recently came out on some TV, but you're a wanter. Now what, I don't mean I want, pearls and jewels. I mean, I want the next thing. I want to, progress, achieve, feel like I make a difference. Feel like what I'm doing makes an impact, has an impact.
Yes. And is there a time in your life where that want and need to constantly progress and not stop and take stock has ended up having a negative impact on you, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a thing called the arrival fallacy. I don't know if you've heard of it. No. So it's basically this concept in psychology that people who actually you get there, you think, oh, once I've lost the weight, or once I've done that, I mean, it's common sense, a lot of this, you're going to feel great. No, because then you're just gone to the next thing. It's almost like a drug, and you're constantly seeking that next, whatever that is. Because once we get there, we reach a sort of a plateau. And then we think, well, actually, then what's next? So in terms of going back to your question, I just think it means when I've had very difficult times in my life, which I've had over the last few years, I've had some really, probably the hardest time in my life over the last few years, I haven't reflected on that either. Right. So I think the need that I have, the drive, I'm very driven to go up and up and up. And up isn't even the right word, because I wouldn't say it's necessarily up, it's forward, maybe. Means that the emotional challenges that I've experienced as well, I don't take a step back. I don't stop. Yeah. Whether it's to go, well done, that was great, I did well there, or that's been really, really difficult.
Yeah. And do you think there's been a period of time where you did manage to extract learnings and wisdom from the challenges you've faced along the way, or do you think you simply just had the blinkers on and went, let's just go for the next thing?
No, absolutely. I've learned where if you'd said to me, 4 years ago where I would be now, not literally sitting here now, but in my life, I would have looked at you like you were absolutely crazy. I would have said, oh my God, no, you really? Because it's been such a huge change. And I think I've really reflected a lot on where I've come from, what's changed, what's happened, how I've progressed, how I've grown, how I've met challenges that I never ever thought I could meet, ever, if you'd said to me 4 years ago. Because I don't think you can predict how you're going to respond to a challenge when it's just a theory, But have I processed it emotionally? Have I sat with the feelings of it? Have I dissolved? No. Now, I can't dissolve to a certain extent because I've got responsibilities and I've got a job, but that, I think, is the bit that matters.
Yeah.
So I can analyse it, I can look at it, I could give you a great explanation of it, of what I've done and how I've achieved. Again, achievement's not the right word, but how I've managed that adversity. Let's say embrace the adversity as we started with. But what I need to learn to do better is to process the feelings of it and give time to that.
And why do you think you haven't?
Because it's difficult, and because it's always further down the to-do list, I think. Because I know that when I go into that space, I've had therapy, lots and lots of therapy in my life. I had to when I was training, and I've had it at difficult times in my life. I need to, if I found somebody, and it doesn't have to be a therapist, it can be a coach, I need somebody to sit down. I've never felt very, it's not common for me to be sitting and talking about myself. So for me to even put myself in that space is quite unusual, to give myself the time to go, right, this is about me. So that time I talked about that I gave those clients all those years ago as a therapist, it's not something I naturally take for myself, very rarely.
Yeah. And do you think that that's driven by the concept of, if you want to feel self-esteem, do esteemable things, so therefore it's easier to be of service to people? Or do you think it's partly because of the fear of what may be revealed?
I think it's much easier to hear from other people. It's much easier, and it's what I do all the time. So, you know, anyone who knows me, we start talking, they go, wait a minute, I asked you how you were about an hour ago, but actually I feel I've talked about myself the whole time. But that's what I do. It's partly because that's how I'm trained to do that. Yeah. That's what I trained to do. But I just think it's easier, and it's and also like I said, everything goes back. I'm one of 5 children. Right. You know, I grew up in a family of 7, and they were all the same. We're very similar age, so we lived together. You know, it wasn't like the one child was like 20 years older than another one. So there was very little space in that family for anybody to actually be heard. Yeah. And take time. Yeah. So you grow up with those sorts of, you know, everyone's interrupting each other over the dinner table.
And which makes a lot of sense. So by the time you were, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just trying to piece together the time. By the time you were kind of early 30s, you had 3 children?
Two children.
2 children, married, and you were well into your career as a therapist. And then what changed? What changed for you to then leave that career and start to pivot into something else?
Yeah, so I was probably in my mid to late 30s by then, and what happened was, I'm quite easy. I need, you know, all human beings, don't they? They need that balance between security and stability, and excitement and independence and adventure. You know, there's that sort of, and those are 2 concepts that I fought with a lot internally in my life. And I had chosen security and stability when I'd got married, when I'd moved to another part of the country. I'd chosen that. And what had happened was I'd repressed the need for my desire to be, you know, excited and sort of stimulated. So that means that's why, although I've stayed in the same organisations maybe for 5 years, 10 years, I've gone from different jobs. And what I realised was I'd achieved what I needed to achieve in the counselling service. There was nothing, I got us accredited, I got a good team, we were doing really well. And also it was sitting in a room a lot of the time. And actually that's not really where I'm best placed, sitting in a room with one person. I realised that I wanted to do something that had more, a wider, be outside in the world. And at the same time, there were some opportunities in the university that came up to work more around wellbeing and psychological health and things that were, we had some community projects, we had some projects that came in, and my boss said to me, why don't you have a go and try and run some of these projects? And I was like, okay, great. So that's what I did. And
did you have any fears going into that change?
No, because I think the security bit meant I was still in the same organisation, and I was still having the, you know, the pension and the salary, and I knew where I was going. But I also think that I've always worked in organisations, I've always done jobs where there's always been a little bit of tension. There's always been a bit, it might not stay. So in the counselling service, it was often said to us, well, we don't really need a counselling service, because actually we can farm it out and you're expensive. So there was always that sort of having to prove, having to fight, and that's how I've always done, always jobs I've done, it's always been a bit bucking a trend. So when I went to ACAS, mental health had just become part of the agenda. I wasn't employed to do with mental health, I was employed to do general advisory work with businesses.
Right.
And then mental health became a thing. I'm like, well, we need to grab this. And one of my colleagues was really into it as well. But again, I was always really, well, mental health isn't really our core business at ACAS, so no, but we need to do this. And I proved it wrong and stayed, and, absolutely, they realised that actually it was central. But it was a fight.
Yeah.
So, as I said, I think it's sort of when you talk about the challenges, it's more just going into another. I like that. I like starting things. I like initiating things. I am quite clear about. You give me an idea, and I'll go, right, this is how we're going to implement that idea. This is the strategy. This is how we're going to do it. But once I've done it, I'm then a little bit bored, and I need the next thing.
Yes. Yeah. Which I can relate to that deeply. That's for sure. So, and you alluded to before. Around the fact that recently there's been some more challenges going on for you. Are you comfortable to sort of elaborate on what that is?
Well, personally and professionally, I changed my whole life in the last few years. So again, where we talk about security, my need for change and adventure and growth overtook my need for security.
Right.
So as I said, these are two very common parallels that we all have in with us. Some of us have more than others. And so in 2020, I became self-employed. So I left my very secure job. But when I talked before about this having to always fight, what I've also learned over the few years is actually sometimes you can't change a system. Sometimes you've just got to accept. So ACAS decided this was as big as they were going to go with mental health.
Yeah.
So whereas my ideas were huge, they could only go this big. And I got tired of fighting. And it's the same at the university to a certain extent. I got tired of having to prove that we needed to do this work, the work that I was doing.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really important lesson that I've learned. And I've seen a lot in organisations. I know I've gone slightly off topic here, but you go to a job, don't you? Start a job and you think, nobody thinks I want to be really rubbish at this job, do we? Most people start a job. And then what happens, you go into an organisation and you're quite, excited. This is how I tend to, I'm really excited. We can do this. And then what happens with people is sometimes that gets borne out occasionally, but sometimes you then get a little bit institutionalised. You realise actually there are systems in place, there are processes in place, and however much strong-willed you aren't going to buck those systems. And there are people who politically are just going to do well just because that's how the way the world works. Yeah. And then what happens is people either go, okay, do you know what? It's safe. I've got a good pension. I quite like my colleagues. It's all right. I'm going to put up with this. It's fine. And other people go, no, actually, I'm not going to put up with this. And sometimes people become burnt out because actually they put up with it for too long and they stay. And then some people go, no, actually, I'm not going to put up with this because actually I'm going to take this fight somewhere else.
Yeah.
And I think what happened personally in my marriage and in my professional life, those things paralleled. So I left ACAS because I just felt like I was going to take my fight elsewhere. I wasn't valued enough. I didn't feel like I had the opportunity to really grow what I wanted to. And I'd say the same thing happened to my marriage. So my marriage ended as well. So in 4 years, I moved from living in a really lovely big house, being married to somebody, having obviously I've got my children still, having a pension, having all of the trappings of sort of a stable, secure life, to being self-employed, going from a 5-bedroom house, I now live in a 2-bedroom flat. I've moved to another part of the country. But the thing is, I don't talk about it. So nobody, I keep this to myself because professionally, as I said, we go back to that thing of having to be strong and how can you admit vulnerability? And I think when you're self-employed, it's very difficult.
And how do you think you started? Because obviously that's a lot of change, and change, from my experience, isn't necessarily a bad thing. And again, from my experience, change outside of my control usually isn't a bad thing, but that doesn't mean that the change is any easier to deal with, which talks to your point around, well, you can't skip through the adversity. If you're in adversity, you're in it, and then afterwards you have a choice to reflect. How do you think you found, I'm not saying you have found complete acceptance, but started to find acceptance around what's happened and this new period of your life and everything you've just described there, do you think you've started to find acceptance on it? Do you think it's something you've yet to deal with? How have you managed that process?
Well, I think, again, what I've learned is I spent a long time struggling with these two decisions.
Yeah.
A long time. I was unhappy for a long time, but not totally unhappy, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Sort of, and what I've learned is, wow, I did something, I made a huge change. I activated that. My locus of control internally decided I can do this and I'm going to change this. I'd never, ever spent a night by myself alone in all of my life, ever.
Wow.
And then suddenly I have living by myself in a house by myself.
And how was that?
Well, the first night, this was the interim house, not where I live now. The first night, my sister had stayed and then she left. And the first night I remember thinking, well, I know what I can do. And when we're fearful, when we feel like that, when we don't want to be alone, it's often as much about an external threat as it is an internal threat. So our internal fears of the bogeyman is not real. It's an internal fear about something much deeper, about being alone, about being left, about being abandoned. It's a very complex process. I didn't actually think somebody was going to break into my house. So it's much more of an internal fear.
Yeah.
So, but I thought practically, well, actually the chances of somebody doing that, very unlikely. I can sleep downstairs on the sofa, so I've got 2 exits, So I thought about it practically. And then I thought to myself, well, wait a minute, why don't I just imagine that my sister's still in the other room? The bogeyman doesn't know whether she's here tonight or whether she was here last night. And that's what I did. And so I just reframed it in my head and it was fine. And then a couple of months ago, when I moved into my new flat, my daughter was living with my daughter, and 2 nights running, I wasn't there, 2 nights running, somebody came and banged on the door really, really badly, banged on the door, tried to get in. She was terrified, understandably. So the next night I said, I must make sure I'm there, because I just thought, and I was ready for them. Do you know what I mean? I was not going to so my power and strength from what I've gone through if I sit back and I think, wow, I didn't want to sleep by myself 2 years ago, and now I'm like standing there going, just you try it.
Yeah, exactly. And I've learned there's an awful lot of positivity and recognition and celebration in just simply trying to deal with something. So everything you described there, just even starting the process of wrestling with the decision should be celebrated. Doing the decision should be celebrated. Executing it, moving on, learn, all of it should be celebrated, because of course, simply doing nothing is often the worst thing to do. It can sometimes be the best thing to do if you're trying to avoid conflict, but in terms of your own personal challenges, if it's something that's not changing, the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result kind of approach. And I think it's huge. So and what's interesting is listening to you, perhaps you've got some awareness around it, but it's what you've achieved there is quite a huge thing. And I suspect as the years go on, you'll think more and more around the fact that that was a really big achievement. And do you think it's impacted you in your professional life in any way? Do you think it's shaped you in your professional life, and how so? If
I think so. I mean, just going back to your point, the brain, we don't like uncertainty.
Yeah.
So you're right. So sitting with that decision is part of the process, but we can't predict. Our brain is incapable of predicting how we're going to cope with something. So, you think about the pandemic, once the change was, we knew that we couldn't go out. That was people can cope with that because they know what they've got to deal with. But when you're sitting in that uncertainty for a long time, it's very hard for us to cope with. Yeah, it's much more stressful than, okay, this is now what I've got to deal with. I've now got to deal with, the fact that I have to get insurance for my house. I had no idea about things like this because I lived in a very sort of, different relationship. So professionally, it's, I haven't mentioned this, but a long time ago I had anxiety. I had an anxiety disorder. That has definitely helped me as I've learned what that was about and what happened. It wasn't diagnosed, but I know what it was. That's helped me in the work I do. So when I work with people and they talk about their mental health in a professional capacity, I remember how I had to manage those two things at the same time when I was working. So I think that
and what was that, if you don't mind me asking?
So it was after my second child. I developed an anxiety disorder out of nowhere. I mean, nowhere at all. I'd never had it before.
And what does that mean, sorry, for anyone that doesn't know?
So what it means was that, my specific one was health anxiety. So let me just explain this. So the simplest thing to think about it is, if I had a stomach ache, if I have a stomach ache now, I think, I've got a stomach ache, maybe it's something I ate. Totally rational, don't do anything about it. Then it was absolutely obsessive. It's sort of, you can think about it slightly obsessive compulsive disorder, Googling. In 3 years, I had more medical procedures than I've had in my whole life, than I would have in 3 lifetimes. Because every time something physical happens, I decided it was something life-threatening.
Yeah.
At the same time, interestingly, my daughter was really ill. She was ill for quite a lot when she was a baby. I was in and out of hospital, never worried about her. I was absolutely in control of that. But we've only got so much capacity to sort of to manage lots of different anxieties. So what happened was mine manifested in this health anxiety. I also wouldn't go on the tube. I also wouldn't go in lifts. So it's sort of like being trapped.
Yeah,
was also part of the thing.
Yeah.
And then various things happened during this period, over this period, that, we don't get over an anxiety disorder in a day. It's something that, for me, incrementally things happened, and this is when we talk about challenges. So what happened was I was faced with challenges during this period that I overcame, and I think gradually my anxiety became balanced, and then it's gone. I haven't had it since. It was because I thought, oh my gosh, I actually survived that and I was fine. So I had to have an operation, for example.
Yeah.
Because I was actually unwell. And I didn't die. I didn't die in the operating theatre. I came out of it. I had to go to a job once and I had to get the tube because otherwise I couldn't have done the job.
Right.
So I got on the tube. So these little steps, took me to a place where actually it just became rebalanced, recalibrated.
Yeah, which is, I think it goes back to your point around, and actually it's a really good analogy, being sat in a flat by yourself for the first time, spending the night alone for the first time in your life, and then it's like, and in recovery circles, we refer to it as self-centered fear, or false evidence appearing real fear. It's like, well, what's actually going on here? And of course, it's all an internal battle.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of what you're describing there is the health anxiety, and I've had my own journey with anxiety, and it is completely debilitating, and it's all encompassing. And I remember being on the phone to a friend of mine who had it years ago, who I used to think was weird, which is hugely naive of me because I was in my 20s and I was like, this is weird. Why doesn't he want to leave the house? The guy was suffering anxiety. That's what it was.
Absolutely.
But I had no exposure to it, so I'd never paid it any credence. And I was doing jury service, and I was on a trial for 3 weeks, and I couldn't get out of the courtroom. And I was riddled with this anxiety in the booth, having to listen.
Yeah.
And you're not allowed to leave, and if you do leave, it disrupts everything. And I remember calling him and saying, how do you deal with this? And his answer was so annoying at the time, because he was like, there's no real way other than just to face up to it. And I was like, what does that mean? But it means getting on the tube and finding out that when you get off the tube, you're not dead. It means getting to the other side of the self-centered fear to understand it's false, it's not real. And one thing I often ask people, or have been asking people in this context, is, what were your fears going into that, and did any of those fears come true? And I wonder if in your situation, your fears going into the self-employment and the breakup of the marriage, do you feel like any of those fears have come true? They may have, they may not have, I don't know.
Well, I don't think it's sort of a done deal.
No,
so I don't
it's
think
a journey.
It's a journey,
but so far.
No, so far I've survived. I'm fine. I'm managing, and I think it's progressive. So I think but I don't feel. As I said, I was in a very, very solid relationship, very, very, secure, didn't have to worry about things at all. Now I have to worry about things because I do, I mean, it wasn't totally like that. It's not totally the opposite now, but I'll be fine. I'll survive. I've survived. I've made huge change. And I think it's about your internal identity
Yes.
So my identity before used to be not wanting to be alone, you know, being married, all of these trappings, all of these external sort of badges that people wear. Well, now I don't have those badges, but actually it doesn't really matter.
No.
And that sounds really sort of sort of, you know, sort of, what's the word, you know, insular and sort of, you know. But actually, I think as a woman in business, there are certain things that you have to sort of carry with you, you know, that where you are sort of judged on things to a certain extent. So, but now I just feel doesn't matter anymore. I feel and like I've got enough authority and enough credibility, which I felt before, but there was something about the sort of, I don't know, the labels that mattered more, and now the labels don't matter so much.
Exactly. And I think it's a really big lesson for all of us, even, you know, not necessarily just in our personal lives, but in our business lives, you know, around, I can't do this. And it's like, we're all able to achieve much more than I think than we think of ourselves. And often we can do it, you know, and whether that's managing your day in a way that's more efficient, or doing a project for a client that you've not done before, the mind will say, the lie in the mind will be, well, I can't do this, I haven't done it before. And then what I tend to do is break it down, much like in recovery, you just don't have a drink for today. It's not, don't drink for the rest of your life. Well, just
absolutely.
just don't today. See how you feel tomorrow, but just for today. In the same way, it's like, well, I could probably try doing this task for the next half an hour, and then see how that goes. And then half an hour turns into an hour, which turns into a day, which turns into the project's being done. And then you're empowered because you're the other side of it. Do you see what I mean? It's a very similar thing that you're describing. I think it's a really useful lesson to apply in the work context as well as personal life as a result of that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, somebody once said to me, I wanted to become fit. And I said to him, he said to me, why don't you run? You know, he was at the gym. He was a gym guy. And he goes to me, well, have you thought about running? I was like, I can't run, you know. And he said to me, no, not yet. And I thought, wow, that's actually so liberating. No, why would I be able to run? I hadn't, like, you know, hardly walked for like 20 years, you know. I was not a particularly very active person.
Yeah.
And I think anything, so there is definitely a group of people who, and it's the way they're brought up, and it's to do with those early learnings, where they think they should know things. And actually, no, it's how you were taught and how you learned and how you were given chance to fall over and get yourself up, and those sorts of learnings that make you realise, oh, there's a process to getting me to that knowledge or that learning. Whereas some families, that's not how people are parented, so that doesn't happen like that. But look, giving yourself that space, like you say, that half an hour, I'll do it for half an hour and I'll see what happens. Or, no, I can't run yet, but maybe I can walk a bit faster. And it just frees you up from realising that you don't have to suddenly be there immediately.
Yeah, exactly. And what do you think, using your kind of learnings from the change in the careers and you know, your change in personal situation, if I'm someone who's listening to this, or I'm someone who wants to make a change, whether that's internally within my job or whatever it is, what do you think is the biggest thing you've learned about making the start of the new beginning? Like, how have you learned to make that new start? Because that's a big thing, you know, often, and then that can be a big thing relative to a smaller decision. How do I change my approach to my working day because it's a habit and this is how I do my day? Or it could be something as big as leaving your marriage. What do you think your learnings has been about how you approach that new start?
Well, I think you have to make a decision that you want a new start. And I think a lot of us sleepwalk, and I think a lot of us spend a lot of time just sort of on that treadmill. And I think you have to know what drives you, what matters to you. So in terms of sort of, one of the theories is about autonomy, belonging and competence. So ABC, it's known, it's a theory of sort of motivation. So does autonomy matter to you? And for me it does. That's one of the reasons being self-employed was so important. But also belonging matters to me. And that's the bit that you miss when you're self-employed. And then competence, for me, that's important to learn things. So what is it that matters to you? What is the things that actually are going to, you know, drive you? And then are you actually getting those? And it sounds sort of like I'm giving an analysis of it, but you will know instinctively, actually, I just don't feel right. This doesn't feel right. And it's about having the confidence to be able to make that change. And it's a leap. It's a massive leap. But pull people up around you. Think about what your coping strategies are. So for me, it was exercise. You know, I finally learnt to run, so I do a lot of exercise. I had some negative coping strategies, without a doubt. Sometimes getting up and spending an hour watching crappy telly before I got out of bed. That's what helped me get. So don't be hard on yourself. And then those things, you know, we know all those things about, you know, going outside and all those things. But actually, if you are really struggling, don't think that going out for a healthy walk is gonna make the difference. Reach out to people, have people around you, open up to people, seek mentors, whether it's at work, who you can learn from, and then talk things through, and then think about, actually, this isn't right for me, this isn't good enough for me.
Do you think that I can relate to everything you've said there, and I think the reason I can relate to it is because I was broken into, you know, by my journey and my illness, and then that's not the case today, thankfully. Do you think there's been a period of your life where you think, do you know what, I've kind of got this sorted. I may not know it all, but I'm good, compared to a place of, again, I always use the word humility, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that word, where you go, well, actually, I don't, and actually being on the side of I don't is better. Do you relate to that? Or
so I don't know what...
I don't know everything, and actually me not knowing everything, and to simplify the question, I guess, from my experience, I really did think that I knew what was best, and I used to think that I knew the best action to take, and that actually if I had an opinion on something, that was the right way. And that not only was that dramatically not the case, but also life is a hell of a lot easier to navigate, both in terms of client journeys, business performance, and personal life, accepting that fact, because it means that there's so much more room for self-compassion and so much room for being human and falling a bit short. Because it's like, well, I don't know it all, so that's fine. I'm always learning, and I accept that fact. And by accepting that fact, I'm constantly evolving and moving forward. But that feeds into the vulnerability bit again. And really what I'm describing is the ego versus, well, the non-ego, the spiritual, whatever you want to call it. Because the ego is going to go, well, no, we got this sorted. We don't need to do that. We don't need to listen to him. Don't need to listen to this conversation. If I'm not going through something that's forcing me to change, why am I going to change? You know? So I'm wondering if you can relate to that in your life, if you've had a journey with that as well. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that. So we talk about lived experience and mental health, and I think it's really valuable to hear others' experiences. But what we've got to understand, that's just their experience. So I think it's really important to know what you're good at and what you're not so good at. You know, nobody is a finished article. So I know what I'm good at. I know where it's not what I'm good at. I know what gives me a buzz, what gives me what I spend the day doing, that actually I come home and I think, wow, that was really, really, really great. But what I also know is that I think really quickly, I work really quickly, and I have to learn that other people I'm at the end of the journey already, and people are just sort of like putting their coats on. You know, they're just about to start. Yeah. So I've really learned that, to recalibrate and stand back and listen to people who are different from me. So when you talk about your lived experience, people think, oh, everybody's like me, everyone will understand this. Well, no, they weren't. So as I said, I'm already there, but understand that not people, or some people are even further ahead. Yeah. And working to meet each other along those different stages. So whilst we think, like I said before, I never would have thought I'm here. Never would have thought I'm here. I don't even think I've got, I think when you think about people having adversity, you think, oh gosh, he climbed Mount Everest with one leg, or, no, she whatever, did this. But actually, I think what I'm talking about and what we're discussing today is just that most people go through some crappy times in their lives. And I think we can all learn from each other's crappy times and how they managed them. Yeah. And what they did. Absolutely, yeah. And that actually it's, the community of people that we're surrounded by, whether it's in the workplace or otherwise, is really useful for debunking, the lies that I know I experienced, which was, I'm the only one going through this and I can't possibly let anyone else know because they'll think I'm weak. Exactly. In an extreme case, or in another case perhaps not. And all the lessons that come with that in terms of being better at what we do, And actually a bit of what you were describing there, because I deeply relate to, I'm fifth gear and I don't think I've ever been in another gear. You know? It's like that's the only one I've ever known. You know? And it's only in my kind of more adult, sober life that I've realised, oh wow, like other people aren't like that, and not only are they not like that, it's not useful for me to be like that with them. So I'm constantly trying to pull myself back. Yeah. And actually, one tool I think that's really useful is checking ourselves first and stepping back before we then step in. And that's so applicable to business as well as life. You know.
Yes.
Because otherwise we suffocate the client, we suffocate the team, and the outcome of the project. You know, that's for me, and obviously my character relating back to what you said. But yeah, no, I really appreciate you coming in and speaking.